And so, Sarah, I'm thrilled to have you here for our KOAN conversation today. And I'd love to have you start by introducing yourself to the group a little bit.
Sure. Thank you for having me, Jen. My name's Sarah McArthur, and at present, I am the CEO of a company called Power of XYZ. And Power of XYZ has been a 3-year startup in which we really helped a specific group of people tell their stories through branding, through website design, through social media, through events, both online, hybrid, and in person, through trainings, through podcast production, through event production, through audio visual production. So we've really worked very hard in the last 3 years to learn to tell people's stories in a way that brings impact. So the majority of people that we have worked with are impact makers, change makers in the world, want to bring something that permeates out to the goodness of the world. And I've always enjoyed being part of those conversations. For me, getting here, though, I've done this for 3 years, but I've been in other companies, and my journey to get here has been an uphill battle of a mountain. So,
Mhm.
having to learn empowerment for myself, having a childhood that was riddled with a lot of different traumas, and coming into adulthood, you almost don't know how to make that transition. And so for me, empowerment has looked like therapy and then realizing, oh, I might need other skills. Where am I lacking in skills? So I um, did therapy, I did group therapy. I also became involved with a form of self defense called empowerment self defense. And that was one of the catalysts that began this lifelong change of understanding my needs, becoming self aware, uh, a journey into not only being okay with myself, but liking myself, um, being somebody who embraces growth, embraces adaptability, and embraces the shifts and change that come with life. So that was the catalyst for a complete change of my career, a complete change of how I went. So when I came into that space, I took a class, changed my life. I started volunteering. I became an instructor. I became the executive director of that particular branch. And then I believe in 2020, I actually got to join through Power of XYZ a bigger movement that was a global movement of bringing violence prevention all over the world, and have just continued to develop and take pieces of learning, of whether it was self leadership or it was something somebody else taught me, or even something somebody taught me about what I don't want to be, what I don't want to bring into the world as a leader. So I think all of those brought me to this place right here and now.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Sarah. I just really enjoyed getting to know you and your story over this last year. And so, before we dive into more specific questions for Sarah, I'd really love to hear what drew you to participate in this conversation today. The title of the event was The Power of Presence Living and Leading from the Inside Out, because in the conversation Sarah and I have had, we both really recognize that any transformation that has happened in our leadership has always begun with recognizing that there was something in us that we needed to go to work on, that we needed to look on in a different way, that was getting in our way of being the fullest expression of ourselves or having the impact in the world that we wanted to have. And so I'm curious for all of you how you practice presence or self awareness in your own leadership and what's compelling about this topic. Are there things that you're hoping to learn today? So, would love to have you enter answers in the chat. I'm going to drop this question so that all of you can see it, and would love to just bring some of your voices into the conversation before we get going. What brought you here today? How do you practice presence in your own leadership? I see some people writing. trying to practice more. That's part of what brought you here today. Thanks for being here, Dina. What else? Excited to learn from you all. One way you practice presence is through deep listening and being focused on the person in front of you. Trying to learn from others, been focused on active listening. Often presence is missing in corporate environments. Isn't that the truth? Active listening to myself and to those that I work with, right? We have this voice inside that we can learn to ignore as well. Yeah, it's so easy to get in our heads in a meeting what something means, how we should take it, what sense we should make of it. How do we bring ourselves back to the present moment? Okay. How do we reset presence when it's been disrupted? Mindfulness, movement, motivation practice in the morning, right? What are the things that we can do proactively or intentionally to set ourselves up for success? So I'm so glad that you've brought these questions, these reflections here with you today. Um, I'm going to go ahead and spotlight Sarah and myself just so that we're a little easier to see for this conversation. As we go, if there are particular things that you hear that resonate, I really invite you to put those in the chat. Oftentimes, if something's resonating for us, it's resonating for other people, and it's nice to have that reinforced. It's really helpful to us as the speakers to know what's resonating or landing with the audience. And certainly, as we go, if you have questions that start to come up, please drop those in the chat. We'll take any clarifying questions as we go. And then at the end, we'll sort of look for themes that might be emerging across them and really work to bring you into the conversation too. Um, yes, Stephanie, sometimes we all need a little timeout, don't we? Right? Those transition moments between something that was disruptive and some important thing that needs our attention. How do we get ourselves from there to being the person we need to be to have the effect we want to have in the world? So, Sarah, one of the things that I loved in our conversations, and you responded to some questions in advance of this, is you've really talked about the ways that your greatest growth has often come from your greatest challenges. And I think that's often true for people, but we don't talk about it all that much. And so I'm curious, what do you attribute that to? Why is it that the things that are often so challenging in the moment also have the potential to be so growth inducing?
I think for me, it's been an evolution. So when I was younger and going through so many things, what I found was that I often ended up ruminating, ended up thinking about the past, living in the past, being stuck in those spaces. And I was really driven by perfection because I felt like that was expected of me, in the environments that I was in. And what I found was that drive to perfection was exhausting, was overwhelming, and really caused me to have a negative inner voice towards myself. Sometimes those things come up because those are years of learning that we begin to unlearn. But I think for me, as I grew in my healing, I feel like my healing's been like an onion, a really big onion, and one layer at a time has come off. And I've had a great therapist, many therapists, but one particularly great therapist who has helped me in those processes. So as I become more self-aware, I have gained the understanding of what can I learn in this experience, in this challenge. And I think that because one of the things I learned as a young person in a lot of uncertainty in my life is I learned to adapt to a lot of different situations. So I think for me, when I think about the challenges, it's what do I need to adapt to? What is happening in the present moment? And then I began to put more frameworks to my thinking because I am somebody who my thinking can run away with me. Now, because I'm more present, I'm able to bring these present questions that help me along, right? So the questions become, um, what is the truth? Like, what is the present moment truth? What are the things that are good that can move forward? What are the things that are challenging to me that I might need more skill in, or I might need to unlearn something? Because part of the experience of having a difficult childhood is that we bring things into our present that were adaptive to us, as my therapist has said to me, that are adapted to us as children. They kept us safe, they kept us alive. But in our adulthood, in our present moment, they are no longer helpful to us and they become maladaptive. And
Mhm.
so learning that experience has helped me to go, okay, is this is this the outcome I'm looking for? Do I have the skill to gain the outcome I'm looking for? So I think asking present questions, sometimes if I'm really activated into another place, what I know from my experience in empowerment self-defense is that I'm actually shifting a different part of my brain. I'm not in the thinking part of my brain, I'm in the survival part of my brain. So sometimes it's as things as like, what is today's date? Let's take some breaths. What is the color of the tree that's outside in front of me? And bring myself back into the present moment. And I
Mhm.
think that those things have helped me to come into a place of, okay, how do I make this a learning experience? And how do I look at what is the next step I want to grow to, and how do I get that? And that's helped me to stay in the present moment and continue to move forward with growth during challenge.
Mhm. Yeah, I really hear you talking about a couple of things. I mean, the descriptions you gave at the beginning really remind me of this distinction between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset, right? That on the one hand, we're sort of at the effect of what's happening to us. And on the other hand, we see the things that are happening around us as circumstances that we have some agency over, right? And so I wonder if there's a moment where you experience that shift or what it is that helped you move from that, state of getting hooked or triggered or sort of caught up in your rumination and started giving you the tools and resources to make different choices in those moments. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I think my therapist was a huge help, because we often talked about mind shifts, and he was great at understanding how the mind works. And when you begin understanding how the mind works, for me at least, it changed a perspective. So he did this one exercise with me that really changed so much for me. And he just said, really quick, take 20 seconds, look around the room and find all the things that are red in the room. And I
Hmm.
said, okay, I did that. And he said, okay, now close your eyes. And he said, now with your eyes closed, I want you to look around, in your mind's eye, look around the room. How many of them were red? And so I was like, I think about 20. And he said, okay, how many were blue? And my mind went, what? And so I started counting in my mind, like what I thought I saw that was blue. And I was like, maybe 8. And he's like, okay, now, open your eyes and really count how many things were blue. And when I did that, I realized there was probably 25, 30 plus things that were blue. And he was explaining like our brains will focus on the things we tell it to, and then the other things it can very easily just mm, take
Erase.
out of view for us. And so one of those things was that experience was like having an experience with a different perspective that made a difference to me. I also think that for a long time, I thought, my brain was broken, I was broken. And so I did a lot of research on how does one fix these things? How do you get better? One of the things that really also shifted things for me was understanding that neuroscience, that our brains are neuroplastic, and so they can change. And that really helped me quite a bit. So I did more research into neuroplasticity and how we can train our brains. And then also with the empowerment self-defense, we did work that was sort of in the adrenalized state, which is that, more survival state of the brain. And
Mm.
in learning to work within that state, I began to find the presence of mind and how do I switch from this part of my brain to this part of my brain. And then I think the last thing I would say is that um, I did ask my therapist at one time because I've been on a healing journey for over 20 years, and it's hard, it's long, it can just feel like you're going in circles, it can feel like you're taking 3 steps forward and 10 steps backwards. And so I asked him, I said, "Have you ever worked with somebody who has PTSD or complex PTSD who has who's not affected by the symptoms anymore?" And he was like, "Yes, I have. There is
Mm,
such a thing as post-traumatic growth." And
mm,
so that really, like, the possibilities for me, like, "Oh, that's
mm.
possible. Oh, somebody else has done that. Now, like, what does that mean for me?" It opens a possibility for me, and I think those are some of the things that have really helped me.
Yeah. I really appreciate that. And I mean, one of the things that's been interesting to me in reflecting on this, and, obviously in the chapter on being adaptive in my book, I talk a lot about the fact that we can only change anything from the present moment, right? And that if the creative thinking part of our brain goes offline, we can't actually solve anything from that place. And yet, very little leadership development focuses on trauma or emotion as on the role that it plays and our ability to coordinate work together well as humans. And you're talking about pretty specific childhood trauma, but I think the research tells us that most people in the workplace have experienced some trauma, right? That
Yes.
coming out of COVID, we've all had this communal traumatic experience. But even before that, the ways in which organizational systems are designed in and of themselves often create some form of trauma, that people find their voices suppressed, that people have experiences of public shaming or of being passed over, disregarded, that there's this sort of accumulation of effects that's just in the air in so many organizations today. And so I'm curious how you draw the connection to leadership, right? How do you get folks into a conversation that connects the dots between trauma and trauma awareness and effective leadership? How do you make those connections?
I think for me, I haven't always been in leadership, and I often was looking like, how can I bring to the forefront what I didn't receive myself? And in the piece of being self-aware, it is knowing what skills I have, knowing what experiences I have, what experiences I've had that have helped to boost my career, that have helped me to have a good experience, and what experiences have I had that have led to like trauma or a bad experience. I have had experiences being a woman of color and having, people say things or pass up, or maybe I didn't have the proper amount of education. So I've had those biases that can happen. I've experienced hardships in the workplace, and one of the things I think as an empath and a sensitive person myself is, how do I bring some of these things into leadership? Some of the things that I really valued was the opportunities to try different things. So I started out in a company who allowed me to start as an admin, try out sales, try out customer service, try out operations management. So I think when there are cultures that allow people to expand, in my last 3 years with Power of XYZ, as I was building a team, we made education opportunities really well known. So we had a business library of educational resources where people could go and learn things that they might just be interested personally. If it was work, we paid for their training to receive work. We gave people the opportunity to expand. What does it look like? Hey, would you like to try this instead? Would you like to move to this opportunity because we think you would be well suited for it? And we gave those experiences. So I looked at some of the things that really came from these experiences I had. I had a lot of people that were really encouraged me, like, hey, we see you And we think that your ability to learn and grow is a great way to do this. So when I hired for the ability to grow, the ability to learn, the desire for expansion, and more for some traits about people that I really wanted as part of our values. And then from there, we began training people in the different tasks. And they had, of course, they brought their own experiences and already training to what they had, but it allowed them for new to experience new things. And so I think that for me, when I look at trauma informed care, I think that leaders who aren't familiar with trauma informed care, the first thing to do is to get some trauma informed training. I think that really there is a shift happening in the world that we're living in. There's a post COVID. I think people are having a greater expectation of the workplaces that they're involved in. And like even Jen, when we've talked, you've talked about becoming a B Corp, what that means. And so I think that part of it is leaders now being self-aware enough to go, I want to be part of the change and I'm willing to take the risks and also fail at it, because when there are systems in place that don't provide safe workplaces, that don't provide opportunity for growth, and they've been there for a very long time, it takes time for that shift to happen. So
Mhm.
if somebody is in leadership, wants to be in leadership, and leadership can mean so many different things, I think it's finding leaders that are self-aware, that are willing to grow, but also willing to learn and have a different perspective, getting some trauma-informed training, learning about different people's personality types. Some people are more analytical. They just like, bottom line, they like things to get done in a very quick way. There are other people who really enjoy people and they want to talk a little bit more and they're suited for different things. So I think that there's so many pieces to this, but I
Mhm.
think starting with trauma informed care and what does it mean to bring a balance of workplace needs to the people's needs? What
Mhm.
flexibilities can we offer? What foundations of expansion can we offer? What support do people need? I think those are the places to start.
Beautiful. Thank you. And you've talked about a particular kind of empowerment training, trauma informed empowerment training that you've participated in. And so, I'd love for you to connect the dots between, these experiences of trauma that can send us into our more reactive, less creative place, and how empowerment training can help with that, right? Like if someone says, maybe I should go get some trauma informed development, what might they expect? How would it change their ability to lead?
That's a great question. I think that for me, my empowerment training became before my leadership training, but I saw the connection there. And I think one of the things that I appreciated most about the type of empowerment training I had was the willingness to create places where the leaders, the instructors of the program I took, were themselves trauma informed. And what they were looking for was when creating scenarios that will activate the brain in different ways. And for some people, it was being able to set a boundary and speak up. That was more my issue. For other people, it was how to come down from being really activated and maybe yelling or having a bigger voice. And so, one of the things is knowing that everybody is different and their needs for empowerment training can look different. And
Mhm.
so I think when we look at those things, it's like, do we know how to set boundaries? So maybe we're looking at an empowerment training that has boundary setting. And the key is we can learn from a book, what a boundary is, how to set a boundary. It's a very different thing when you get to practice setting a boundary and have that part of your brain shift to another place. Have people around you who know that your brain is shifting, who can see the signs that, maybe you're in a different part of your brain, and to be able to coach you and being able to say, oh, let me help you with that. Sometimes it's not just boundaries, sometimes it's communication. So I myself have struggled with communication, and part of it is learning, like, oh, in this particular instance, we can be activated and learn just enough to say, I'm going to pause this conversation and we'll come back to it so that we can ground ourselves. We can write out the things we want to, that we want to think through and come back with a different energy in communications. Some of it could be like, I really need to ask a difficult question. Maybe I want to ask for a raise, and those type of things. So I think that determining what empowerment somebody needs, or wants or desires, and then seeking out organizations who, you see a lot of organizations nowadays that are speaking about trauma-informed training. And
Mhm,
so seeking out organizations that, have trauma-informed training, that are willing to work in, the different parts of our brain. I think those things are really important. One of our clients that we work with is PAVE Prevention, and they bring customized work to the workplace. So they have their own assessments and they bring this customized work to the workplace so that the people they work with can go through and learn some of these skills in the workplace, in the adrenalized state, in that empowerment state, with people who are trauma informed, who are trained, and
mm,
who, having their peers around and everybody's working at it together really can create a connection within the community that I think is
mm,
really important. So there are organizations out there. The organization I worked with, is called Impact Personal Safety of Colorado.
mhm,
There's many different impacts around, but the type of work, that I did was empowerment self-defense, and there's many empowerment self-defense trainings around. So I think that, for me, I took the class to learn physical skills. What I got out of the
mm,
class was life skills.
mhm. Yeah, really
Yeah.
beautiful. And I mean, just to summarize what I think we've been talking about for the first part of this conversation, I think what I'm really taking is that we lose our ability to be creative and resourceful when we're in this adrenalized state that you're talking about, right? So when we get activated, reactivated, we actually move into a part of our brain that's only capable of survival, right? We can't actually plan for the future. We can't come up with creative ideas from that place. Well, that's also true of the people on our team, right? And so as leaders, we're working both sides of that equation, right? There's a self awareness piece, and there's the skills for us to cultivate around our own capacity for presence, our own capacity to recover ourselves when we get
Mhm.
activated. And then there's also an awareness that if an employee is being problematic in some way, if there's some disruption, that the first move is to help them get their brain back online, right? That any sort of discipline or reprimand or corrective action in that activated state doesn't actually produce meaningful, effective change, right? And so we've talked about some skills for doing that. I think, part of this idea of cultivating presence and really thinking about leadership from the inside out, to me, is recognizing that it starts on our side of the table
Mhm.
first. But then from that more resource place ourselves, we can extend empathy and connection out to our team in a different way. I want to shift gears just a little bit because one other interesting part of your personal story is just that you moved around a lot growing up. And you've also talked about how that range of experience so early in your life shaped your capacity for adaptiveness and your ability
Mhm.
to sort of bob and weave with the different things that come your way. And so I'd love to hear you talk about how you experience that in your leadership today. Like, how do you draw on the experiences that you had, being exposed to lots of things, moving around, in being more flexible and more adaptive as a leader today?
Mhm. I think one of the things I do value a lot as a leader is being adaptive, as you're mentioning. And for me, I think I started moving around when I was 8 years old. And so when you move to a new place, especially as a child, there are new schools, new town, new house, new environment, new teachers. There are so many things that are new. And I think newness creates an opportunity for adaptability. And I think that it didn't happen the first go around. I think that especially as children, it can be very scary. But what I did find is that you gain a certain knowledge. Oh, I'm going to move to a new place. That's an expectation. So the expectation is this is a new environment. I lived in different countries, so there was different cultural things to learn. And I think for me, adaptability has become curiosity. So I gained a love of curiosity. So knowing more about the environments I'm in, knowing more about the cultures that I'm in, and how to have new experiences in those spaces and be able to be like, oh, I did that. I had a new experience. I was able to handle that experience in this new space. Those allowed for the shifts and the changes and the making of new friends and the different skill sets. Also, I think that one of the things I learned in that is a level of um, knowing that things can flow in and out of life. And that's really helped me in the adaptability is to be able to receive the things that are in, and then when they're ready to go out because I've moved or because, something has shifted, is to find rituals or ways to allow for the letting go of the things.
Mm,
And that has been really important in being present is
mm,
is moving beyond that curious piece to that flow state, if that
mm,
makes sense.
mm,
So I think that knowing like, oh, what have I learned in the past? What have I experienced in the past that gives me the ability to try something new now to to and the word adapt comes to mind, but to adapt to this current situation. So a lot of times I'm drawing on the skill set that I already have and the presence to know like I have championed and done everything I've needed to do to this point in my life. Like I've
mhm,
survived every change, every piece of adaptability.
mm,
So I think those things for me were one, learning to make mistakes. Hey, I made a mistake. What did I learn from it? Now I'm going to adapt and grow with it. Oh, the scenery has changed. What experiences do I have that allow me to bring that experience into this thing, have a new experience, and then move on to the next thing? So, I think that adaptability really is like a muscle. It
mhm,
is something we become aware of and we continue to participate in, we become curious about it, and we continue to grow that muscle. And soon we realize, like, oh, hey, I'm able to
mm,
shift and change and go with the flow of things in a way that maybe I couldn't do 20 years ago. And I think in the changing workspace, there is a lot of shifting and changing that's happening, a lot of new
mhm,
things that are coming into the spaces, a lot of shifting of leadership, a lot of people that are having the courage to bring a new system into the space. And I know from um, just working with my therapist and stuff that our brain doesn't like to change. It does, and if it
mm,
changes too quickly, it can like really bring us into that survival mode of our brain. And so I think that part of adaptability as is helping to take little steps forward in that space. And it really applies to the workplace because so much is changing so quickly in the workspace, and we're not always going to get it right. And so when those things happen, it's like, oh, we just saw somebody mention the ritual of letting go. Okay, what sticks? What can I grow? What can I let go?
mhm. Yeah, I really appreciate that framing. As you were talking, I had this sort of visual in my mind of, this big sack that we fill up with our experiences. And if we just keep dragging it along, putting more and more stuff into it, eventually it really starts to weigh us down, right? And so what I hear you saying is that we get to be intentional about what we
Mhm.
carry forward and what served us then but won't necessarily serve us going forward or isn't needed for what's next. How do we retain the lightness of being that allows us to be present in the moment and not somehow chained or anchored to
Mm.
those experiences that have served their purpose, right? And now they're allowed to go on their way.
Yeah, and Jen, I do have a quick question for you because
Yeah,
I think it would
please.
be great for you to come in. Is that I really see you as a forerunner in bringing in a new system, which takes a lot of courage. And you spoke about that at the beginning of this conversation, and I would love to hear how your adaptability is brought to the forefront of making the shift from, systems that really haven't so much been for the people, honestly, to systems that are for the people. Starting with your B Corp,
Mhm.
there are, uh, I don't know if you call them guidelines that you have to
Mm.
follow as a B
Mhm.
Corp, and I would love to get your take on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking. I'll say a couple of things. I mean, on the one hand, I've been thinking about and studying these questions most of my life. I also moved around a lot as a kid. I started moving around when I was 8. I very much empathize with that lived experience of the world always being bigger than me, of really recognizing early on that what makes us human looks pretty much the same everywhere, but our ability to mess up how we are with each other can look pretty different, right? That we've got different ways of hurting and harming and creating distance with each other. And I also had lots of experiences early in my professional life of being the first woman, the only woman, the youngest woman, like in rooms that I felt like a trailblazer, a pioneer in for some reason, but also being very lonely, it being very hard and not getting a lot of support or encouragement. I often felt like I was in a fight mode, right? I learned to be a warrior in my 20s and 30s. And I broke a few doors down, right? And so it created success inside a system that once I got to a certain level of success, I sort of looked around and said, huh, is this really where I want to be? Or how, now that I've arrived with this seat at this table, do I want to spend that capital that I've accrued and sort of, fighting my way in? And the first thing that really showed up is like, wow, I have burned my system out, right? Like cortisol overload, adrenal fatigue, just exhaustion, lack of, emotional centeredness in a lot of places. And so I spent a lot of time in my 40s really looking at what is the life I want to live and what is the kind of future that I want to create. Like I had this sort of theoretical concept from my academic work, from work that I'd done with clients, but how to really live into that felt super mysterious, right? And I couldn't find my way there without first really beginning on the inside with myself. But now over these last, 5, 6 years, I'm into my 50s now. And this really feels like the chapter where I get to take those experiences and stand like in this moment in a much more rooted, present place, knowing that all of those things come with me when I walk in the room, right? I don't have to hold on to them too tightly. They're already in me. And so part of the process of becoming a B Corp was really looking at those guidelines, looking at the requirements well in advance of beginning the application process, looking at what already aligned with our values and principles and who we were, and then taking that as guidance to formalize things that were more informal. As we were doing things like rewriting the employee handbook or making choices about vendors and partners, really over several years, we use the guidelines from B Corp, and really the motivation to become a B Corp is about wanting to be part of a community, right? Not wanting to be off on an island by ourselves trying to figure it out, but being part of a global movement that believes that business can be a force for good and that there are different ways that not only can work, but ultimately will be more effective once we get some of these other systems to shift and really set momentum in that direction. And so, a lot of where I have my attention today is on how do I need to continue to grow and evolve. I tell my team all the time that I feel like my own leadership needs to evolve every 3 to 6 months, right? Like, if what you're up to as a leader is leading change and leading transformational change, then you've got to be up for that ride yourself, right? And recognize that whatever this moment calls for is going to be different from what the moment 3 months from now or 6 months from now is going to be calling for. And so it's not the easy way to be an executive, right? Or to be a leader, but it's a pretty powerful and pretty meaningful way. And when you look at the impact that it can create, the invitation that it causes for people to, believe that they can have a work life that's not such at odds with each other, that you really can integrate those in a way that, you love what you get to do at work all day because it feeds your life, and who you get to be at home makes you even better at what you're doing at work. So that's a short, I can talk for a long time about that question. So thank you for asking it.
Jen, I think one of the things that we've touched on a little bit, but haven't brought up a lot, and I'm hearing what you're talking about, and also what I'm speaking on, is I think part of the power of presence is intentionality.
Absolutely.
Intentionality in leadership is really important. Like, what are the values of the organization? What are the values of the leadership? What are the personal values that we hold? And then how do we intend those to shift and create spaces that are welcoming, that are expansive, that are curious, um, those type of things. So I think intentionality is part of that power of presence. That's so incredibly informative. And what's really informative and curious about intention is that we can have an intention and then realize that our skill level and our intention aren't in the same place. So we can go like, oh, I really intended to do that. Oh, I really messed that up. I really did something or said something wrong here.
Mhm.
So now what do I need to do to change? How do I need to grow? What
Mhm.
training do I need as a leader? What skills do I need to bring so that my intentionality and my opportunities and actions match each other? And so
Yeah.
I would say that for leadership, but I also really love, because I spent a lot of time as not a leader in many organizations, as intentionality in you know everyday working folks. I
Mhm.
think that's so important. I think one of the greatest things my therapist ever did for me is, who are you? What are your values? What is your relationship to yourself? What do you want in life? And really explore that. Like, spend the next year really exploring that. What I found in that process was I learned a lot about myself, but also I learned a sturdiness about where I
Mhm.
am and who I am as a person. And it also allows me to see where I have space for growth, where I have place for curiosity, and where I have a need for learning, for expansion. And so I
Yeah.
think that intentionality is really a key piece of the power
Mhm.
presence.
Yeah, I mean, I think that really is at the heart of this idea of being a purpose driven leader, right? That the clearer our purpose is, the clearer our intention is, the easier it is to see the gap between that desired future and where we are today, so that we can reveal what we need to do to move from this moment into the next and the next and the next. And, I think that the challenge sometimes is when we decouple that intentionality from presence, right? And when we get so focused on future, we're sort of in a state of like worry and anxiety and drive that actually pulls us out of our ability to be present here because we're focused on what hasn't happened yet or what we wish happened instead. And so I think it's really pairing those things, right? Like, how do I get so clear about what matters to me and where I'm going that I can tell whether I'm on the mark or not, and yet hold that future lightly enough that I can be resourced and effective in this moment right here.
Mhm. Absolutely.
I see Angel has a question in the chat. So, Angel, I wonder if you'd be willing to speak it out loud. And then, please, an invitation to the rest of the group. If you have questions, please add them to the chat or raise your hand and we'll come to you after Angel.
Hi.
Hi.
I wrote that so I didn't have to say it out loud, but I will. Okay. Um, this is wonderful talk. I love it very, very much. I think for my leadership, I'm looking at how do I show up authentically and have conversations and but I also know that sometimes I get really excited about something, and so I can come on a little strong, and then after it's like, oh, I came on really strong. And so I question is sort of thinking about that trauma informed lens and sort of, if you're working with a group that maybe isn't having this conversation. I'm a consultant, so it's just me and I have clients and I talk with them, and it goes really well, and it's very feels like personality driven in a lot of ways. And part of my personality is that I'm very authentic. But in that moment where there's like, oh, there was a lot. How do I go back? And I have the way I do that, and it's kind of working for me. But I'm curious from your perspective when you feel like, oh, I stepped out of my center in a space where I respect the people I work with in this space, and I don't want them left with that feeling. How am I taking all this learning into maybe a conversation that isn't with the people that you've been in these amazing rooms with that you shared with before, but clients on the outside, I guess. That makes sense.
Do you want to take that first, Sarah? And then I'm happy to build on it.
Sure. Um, I think that one, I love that you're self-aware, that you're aware like, oh, hey, I get really excited and then I can come on strong with in that space. So one of the things for me, I always love practices because I think practices really help our brain, is to take that excitement and write it out. So you're putting all that energy into a written piece before you're presenting it. Unless it's like right on, like, oh, this is happening right in the moment. I'm getting an idea right in the moment. But if you have time before, is to write it out and be able to release that energy sort of into the world, into that excitement of who you are, and then go back and read it and really simplify like what are the things that are going to get my point across, bring the excitement, but also allow that curiosity of other people's excitement to come with us. So I think some of the things in sharing excitement is to share and then ask the curious questions. Like, oh, what are you curious about? And I think that once you ask that, what are you curious about? And it allows other people to explore, it can really bring a very authentic and balanced conversation. And so I'm all about practice. If you're in the moment and you're aware that, oh, I really do this, one of the things you can do is to, if you're aware enough, is to give yourself a moment to breathe, right? Maybe you give a 3-second breath, like 1, 2, 3. Okay, so you're bringing down your excitement just a little bit. And then also you're looking at people in the room. How are people responding? Are they feeling a little bit, most people will respond in body language, even if they're unaware that responding. And so as you can begin to train your brain to just look at like what's happening around the room, how are people responding, those breaths of like taking a pause, allowing for silence often can bring us back into our bodies. And if you really need a reminder is to be able to shift your brain a little bit to make a remark about something that's present. So, oh, I really like that this is an open space. I really value the relationship with this person who brought me in. And those questions can help just bring you back into the present moment. Those would be my thoughts.
Mm, beautiful. I think
Question was
if
more
I'm
just
under,
maybe Jennifer, maybe you can speak to it. The question is, so those are practices that I do a lot, and I've heard and I love that you said that. It's really validating. So before I get very excited, so I'm like, okay, and I've learned about how to step back and do all that stuff, and it's great. it's when I don't is the question. It's like, so
Mhm.
we're talking about the aftermath
Oh,
of
the
like,
aftermath.
it doesn't happen all the time, but every once in a while, it's like you notice that as a moment. And that's the little sticking point that I'm not sure how to navigate because it gets a little, it happened already. Like,
Mhm.
Yeah.
um, so maybe you're going
Well,
to speak to that.
yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. I mean, and I really feel like this is a continuing part of my own leadership edge, right? I have a lot of energy. I have a lot of enthusiasm. I've learned over the years that I have a different time horizon, right? I am very much a visionary. I can see how this all can work out 2, 3 years in the future. And I can lose people along the way, right? And I can get caught up in like my excitement and my enthusiasm. And then I get impatient with people who can already see the thing that I can so clearly see is absolutely already perfect, right? And so like I'm so in my energy and my excitement that I sometimes miss that I'm steamrolling people a little bit, or that I'm not making enough space for other people in the conversation, or I leave that conversation and then after the fact I hear that there was an impact that I wasn't conscious of, or that someone read my energy as mad instead of as excited, right? And so one, I've learned that that's, how I can show up some days, and I try to modulate it in the moment, but mostly I've just learned to own it as close in the moment as possible when it happens, right? And so if I've had a conversation like that and I come out and either I have a feeling like, oh, that didn't go exactly the way I wanted, or I think maybe I talked over so and they had a point, or I hear after the fact that, so and so was dislocated by something I said, I really make a point of going back and saying, that conversation didn't go exactly the way I think either of us wanted it to. And again, it goes back to the purpose and the intentionality, right? Like the more clearly those things have been articulated up front, the easier it is to point back to them and say, I think this is where we're trying to go. It looks to me like this is where we got off the mark. If you haven't articulated any of those things in the first place, all you're left with is, did it feel good or did it not feel good? And how do we make it feel a little bit better? And so I do think that there are some proactive things to do to set the context that we're in together, right? What is it that we're trying to accomplish? What is it that we're striving for that we all care about? So that when disruption happens, the move is to acknowledge whatever part we played in the disruption so that people feel seen, feel heard, feel validated, and then come back to, when I was so excited, I was trying to get us to this place we all said we were caring about. And I think I missed some things along the way. Can you help me get back on the path? Right. And then it's like an invitation to join us in our imperfection, in finding our way to some place that we all want to go together. How does that resonate? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I like the starting things out in my best versions of myself. I try to apply those things. So it's really great to the empathy part too. It's like sounds like you've experienced that too. You're like, oh no, like okay, you know what, I'm human, and I really want this to happen, and to articulate it on the back end is also valuable to hear. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, beautiful. And Stephanie, did you have your hand up a minute ago?
Hi, thanks. I
Hi.
did. I feel like you might have answered my question as you were speaking. Sarah and Jennifer, thank you for the tips. It's
Mhm.
very helpful. My question originally was, how how are you being present while managing the power dynamic that does exist in workplaces? Just to
Yeah.
address that directly. And I felt like you started to, or you were, Jennifer, but
Mhm.
really, truly, that we can show up and with all the best intentions, I'm here for you, I'm listening, we're a team, we're collaborating, and still in the minds of the people working with you, they understand that there's a different dynamic here. You hold a certain um,
Yeah,
power, for lack of a
absolutely.
better word. Mhm.
Yeah. And I mean, I think in my own leadership, that's something I've really had to learn my way into a little bit. That I think in my earliest days as a most senior executive, I wanted to believe that power didn't need to matter as much as it actually does. And I think I've become more effective as I've recognized the places where power is at play, and I need to acknowledge it and be responsible for it, right? That the best move I have to diffuse and distribute power, if that's what I'm after, is naming and acknowledging it where it actually exists, right? If we try to deny or ignore power where it lives, we just have people feel like their experience isn't real, that it doesn't give them a way to shape or influence the conversation. Whereas if we can name the reality of the dynamic, it helps people see where they can contribute, right? And to take more seriously your invitations to openness, to contribution, et cetera. And so I don't think you can make it go away completely, although we're making lots of moves to sort of share and distribute power more broadly. But I think it takes transparency and it takes consistency, right? That part of what creates that transformation is a building of trust over time when people experience you operating in ways that are different from what they've been socialized to expect. And truly, even in an organization that is so overtly focused on building the future of work in a very human first way, who's hired team members who believe those things in their bones, we've still all been patterned by a society that operates in certain ways. And some people have learned to speak up and hold on and fight hard for the things they care about. And other people have learned to like fly below the radar a little bit and put your head down and get the work done. And as a leader, like being curious about how your team members have learned to navigate power, I think is really important. And because it's not going to be the same for everyone on your team. And so if you want to get everyone's voices in, your approach might need to be a little bit different. And
Thank
with
you.
that, we are at beyond the top of the hour. So I'm going to respect everyone's time and wrap things up. I do just want to quickly share who our next guest is going to be. In just a couple weeks, on July 24th, the CEO of Emerging Women, Chantal Purat, who's also a dear, dear friend of mine. We've known each other for about a decade and grown our companies side by side, will be joining me really to talk about the network component of KOAN and how to really leverage the power of we, the power of community, and how to lead transformation in partnership. So we hope you'll keep up with the conversation. It was lovely seeing you all here today. Thank you, Sarah, for joining me and for this wonderful conversation. We'll have the recording up on the website soon, and you'll all receive a link to it in your email. Thanks so much for being here today. Great to see you all.
Thank you for
Bye-bye.
having me.